The race to World First for Castle Nathria concluded just a few short weeks ago, with complexity limit narrowly beating out Echo in one of the closest races we've seen so far. A short while afterwards, Preach held a roundtable discussion in regards to the race to World First with some of the top brass from the top two guilds of the world, Max and Taggz representing Complexity Limit, and Scripe and ROGERBROWN representing Echo. Together they discussed a number of points in regards to the race to World First, many of which I will look to elaborate on for you today, as well as weigh in with some opinions of my own. Will we ever see a true global release? Maybe we'll see the race to World First competed on a tournament realm. We'll cover these topics and more in today's video.
Warning, warning, opinions ahead.
Understand that this is an opinion piece. While I'm aware that many of you will have your own opinions, these are, again, my own opinions. And whether you agree or disagree with anything that I have to say, I want to hear what it is you have to say. So please leave a comment down below. With that being said, let's get right into it.
Yeah, so Shadowlands is a lot different, actually. We had, I would say before Nyalotha, the most kind of prep. Okay, let's separate like strat prep and player prep, because obviously the player prep thing has gone up and down for, especially going from last expansion to this expansion with AP and everything.
Max has already touched on a very interesting point. AP was such a mainstay system of both Legion and BFA, and now has suddenly been removed in Shadowlands, with Anima Power offering nothing more than a little bit of cosmetic flavour to your Covenant Sanctum. This has opened up a lot more free time for the player when it comes to actually preparing your characters for Mythic progression. The focus has shifted, and instead of having 1 to 3 characters depending on what it was that you were going to be playing, farming as much AP as possible for the upcoming Mythic progression, a lot of players were now leveling and maintaining several of the same class. For me myself, for example, I had 3 warriors, and the idea of this was to take each of those characters through a heroic split, and then the one that you would end up playing for progression was the one that got the luckiest with gear. This is the thing. In Shadowlands it looks like that gear is going to be the grind. Gear availability has been reduced across many of the main forms of gear in the past. M+ loot has been reduced. Heroic raid loot has been reduced. PvP loot has been increased ever so slightly, and it's now targeted, which we'll get into more in just a moment. So now the focus was entirely on having several of the same class, and this was just to force loot RNG. While one of my warriors got lucky and managed to get a weapon from one of their heroic splits, not everyone in the guild was this lucky. Many of them didn't get a weapon, and it meant that their decision came down more to, did they loot a particular trinket? And what about the gear that they did loot? Were there better stats on one of their characters than the other? A lot of things had to be taken into consideration, but the focus definitely shifted in the early part of Shadowlands.
Yeah, so our preparation was probably maybe 40 to 50 hours plus, even just in strat discussions in the first part of the expansion, done completely outside of what the players were doing to prepare for the raid. So it was pretty extreme. And then the player thing, you actually want to throw it to Echo, because they I think outworked is the right word. I mean, I know you had a take, Preach, that was like talking about how interesting you thought the preparation difference was between Echo and Limit. Echo just went fucking wild. Like they just did they did unholy shit with characters. Like even like when we saw what they were doing when the expansion released, we even typed in our Discord like, yo, if you guys want to, maybe juice a couple of your alts you're never going to play in progression and level a couple more mains, we'll think about it. And I'll bring it over to them, because it actually...
Max's point here about Echo's number of characters that they were preparing on some of their players is actually quite an interesting one. And I agree with where he says that it probably would have worked out if the amount of gear dropping from Heroic hadn't been reduced. Some of the players in Echo ended up having 9 characters each. I believe their hard limit was set to 6, some of them took it upon themselves to go as far as 9. While it offered them a lot more opportunity in terms of forcing loot RNG on one particular character, it did end up potentially taking a lot of time away from the rest of the week and a lot of other aspects of the game that ended up being quite as important. Mythic Plus we knew was probably not going to drop as higher item level to be able to enable heroic trading. That much was known for sure. What I don't think we realised was that it was actually going to be dropping 210 gear. This was a bit of a surprise to us, as it meant that it was close enough with Heroic that it could compete on certain slots, especially some of the trinkets when it came to melee DPS, while not going overboard and enabling some of the trading inside of Heroic Raid itself. PvP also ended up becoming quite important when it came to the gearing strategy and the preparation for Mythic, and a lot of the time may have been detracted away from PvP for Echo as well. It feels like they bit off a little bit more than they could chew, but it wasn't entirely their fault. I think their strategy was actually very solid with having that many characters, just to try and force the loot RNG, but it was underestimated exactly how important the other aspects of the game would be in terms of gearing for Mythic progression.
PvP is
really all over
and
the
we'll
place.
and we'll talk about this when you go into BOEs, which I assume you want to transition to next. But like that's what we were wearing with like look at both of our guilds. Like, yeah, we had crazy eye level. I think we both killed Denathrius at 220. But like our raiders are wearing, you know, I saw a couple of takes on Twitter from PvPers and Mythic Plusers that are like, oh man, like we're pointing the finger at each other when it should be pointing it at raiders. Like, and I'm looking at our guild, like our raiders are wearing 4 Mythic BOEs. They're wearing like 2100 PvP upgraded items. They have 2 10s that they've farmed in Mythic Plus and the other slots. And then they have a vault slot and literally at most 1 item total from the entire raid that they maybe don't even want. And it's not raid. Like PvP for us, like Mythic Plus serves its early purpose. PvP is the end game, and then like by the like 4 months from now, we'll probably all have like full Mythic gear or something eventually.
So the whole gearing strategy going into the first tier of Shadowlands has ended up being entirely different, simply due to the fact that the Heroic Raid is dropping significantly less gear overall. With the Heroic Raid dropping significantly less gear and the sheer number of BOEs available to each individual class being probably the highest that I've seen it in quite some time, with a minimum of 4 BOEs each, it's resulted in things like PvP where you can target specific pieces of gear and upgrade them up to a 226 level, really outrageously important. We're now at a point where in order to be a proper world first raider, you have to be talented at multiple aspects of the game. You cannot just be a good raider anymore. You now have to have some aptitude for PvP in order to obtain the rating that you'll need at 2100, which that early on is not the easiest thing in the world to do, as well as being able to get through any kind of Mythic Plus quickly and effectively with minimum gear at quite a high level. Plus 15s in the first week of the season, very difficult. Not the easiest thing, very time consuming. It did also depend on the type of group that you had. Given that most guilds were trying to do armor stacks for the plus 15s, in order to make sure that they had as much opportunity to get as much gear as possible, it ended up becoming quite difficult. Having a full cloth stack is not the most fun experience in the world when you come to a dungeon which requires a lot of kicks. Looking at you, the other side, Plaguefall, there's a bunch of them. Sanguine Depths, there's a bunch of them.
And they've said it vocally. As much as the, you know, top end community, or as it's often referred to, or literally just the top guilds that do these splits, they've made multiple changes vocally to nerf those splits. It's probably the main reason Guild Master Loot doesn't exist, where it would be good for almost anyone that would want to utilize it. Obviously, it would be a choice. But they do all these like roundabout kind of weird ways to nerf splits, like making legendaries just under the eye level you'd need to trade, you know, stuff like that, where they could just get it all in one go. And just like he said, first 3 weeks, you just can't trade items, right? And then it's just splits are over. Like, we don't want, like, as much as we...
Max's point about potentially locking the first 3 weeks of a tier from trading gear is quite an interesting one, but probably not the way to go, as I think it'll just negatively impact the community at large. All it would really solve for the World First guilds is that they wouldn't be looking to do as many split runs when it came to the first week of Mythic, or the second week of Mythic, if that second week was even seen. While it does cut down their reclearing opportunities and going back through Heroic, I don't necessarily think that it's the right choice.
Do sometimes degenerate stuff because we're always going to do the thing that gives us the best chance of, you know, getting the most gear and winning and all that stuff. But none of us want to do splits. Like, no one likes that. Just like do the one run on your character, do what you need to do on your characters after that, you know.
He's right. No one likes splits. It's not something that we want to do. It's not something that we enjoy doing. It is some of the most tedious content that you can do in this game at this level.
We'll always do it if there's worth doing it, but it's like, it's becoming, this expansion and the last expansion, they've just gone and tried to make it as not worth it as possible over and over and over again. So it's like you're still doing it, but the worth is just a million times less than it was when you could make Master Loot runs for people, and it just feels really bad.
Ultimately, the removal of Master Looter I actually think has ended up being quite a good thing now, especially with the lengths that guilds have proven that they will go to in order to get as much of an advantage as possible before progression actually begins. If Master Looter was still a thing, and if full trading was available, I would go as far as to say you might even see almost 20 split raids done in order to target individual characters with gear. There is no way that Blizzard will ever kill off split runs. I think there is potentially a way to limit the amount that are done, but I don't have any ideas for that off the top of my head. All of the world first guilds are too determined to get any kind of advantage possible. I don't think you're ever going to kill split runs. They will continue to try. Maybe the lockout idea of not being able to trade gear at all in the first 3 weeks is a way forward, but I just don't see that impacting anything in a positive way, at least when it comes to the wider community. And as we all know, Blizzard have always looked towards the wider community with pretty much any and every change that they've made.
Echo seems angry, like actually angry.
Like, you know what's the best part? When you have people whisper you or come to your Discord and DM you and be like, hey, I got this vanilla 226 item, no socket, no leads, avoidance, nothing, right? Like just the boots, for example. Yeah, I was thinking, do you want to buy it for 6.7 million? And I'm like, bro, 6.7 million for just a vanilla item? Like, this was my beast, my mythic level beast corruption item in the previous tier. And you guys, like, I don't know, it went way out of hand. And to pour salt into the wound, we also had this new meta apparently, which honestly, I think it should stop right here, right now, of come join our raids. And if you trade us an item, we'll pay you even more gold because we're so rich. I think Pieces started it.
Yep, that was Pieces' fault.
And then everyone just jumped in on it. And then I was getting whispers a week after the race was over. Hey, I trade you this item. Here's the clip. You still owe me some gold. And I'm like, God damn it! Like, what have we done in this game?
That's quite an interesting point. First off, we'll hit the topic of BOEs. BOEs are not necessary in this game anymore, I feel. BOEs are a very sort of archaic system, and while they were rare and you didn't get many of them, they were brilliant. Ny'alotha seemed to introduce this very weird system of BOEs where you would get a lot of them drop, which was okay, because that was when corruption was still a thing. So the majority of the items that ended up dropping were fairly useless, but the ones that actually had a good corruption on it and were worth it, they were very worth it, and they ended up being very expensive as a result, and certainly worth a lot of DPS in terms of a gold to DPS conversion rate. Unfortunately, the rate at which BOE drops occurred still seemed to be quite high as you went into Castle Nathria, not to mention the sheer number of BOEs that were available for individual classes. As a plate wearer, in fact as anyone, you could get 4 BOEs, and they were dropping very often. This resulted in guilds just buying all of the BOEs that they could. It ended up costing a lot of guilds more money than even Ny'alotha did, and just killing out all of their raiders with all of the BOEs possible. So now suddenly 4 of your slots are taken up by BOEs. You haven't had to do anything in order to achieve this gear, you've just been sent it in the mail. There's nothing interesting about that. And here's the thing with BOEs. BOEs are not an inherent advantage over another guild, not at the Race to World First level. Because you know that every guild around this level is going to be doing that. They are going to be buying the items and they are going to be sending it to the raiders. You are gaining no advantage over the guilds around you. The only thing that you get is a slight power advantage over the raid itself. There's no skill involved in terms of something that you found, a strategy that you found over one of your main competitors. All you've done is gone, dropped some gold, and then put an item on one of your raiders. And it's just not interesting. It's so irrelevant at this point. The BOEs themselves, I think, were appropriately powerful in Nathria, at least in comparison to Ny'alotha. They were just items. That's all they were. It's just the fact that there were so many of them, in combination with the fact that the raid itself ended up dropping absolutely nothing at all. It was more worthwhile to kill Shriekwing and then do multiple trash clear runs for a day, and you would get more gear out of that than actually trying to clear the raid itself. If the Race to World First wasn't a thing and people were only in it for the power gain, that would have been the way forward. Luckily, we need to kill bosses. The issue of BOEs is not something that's felt by all guilds equally. You have the guilds at the Race to World First level who only feel it from a guild aspect. You need to have the gold in order to be able to spend it on all of the BOEs that are required on top of the other costs in terms of all the consumables and what have you. But as you go down the ranks, that issue becomes less of a guild issue and more of a personal player issue. Suddenly, if you're in a lower rank guild, and a lot of the people around you and your friends who have a lot of gold, they go around buying BOEs, and suddenly your impact in the raid is diminished as a result, it doesn't feel great. It really doesn't feel great, especially when there are so many BOEs that can be bought.
The only thing, the global release is the only thing that'll work. It's ridiculous to ask Echo to make NA characters. I can tell you straight away.
Okay, so before we go into this topic any further, I feel like I need to completely elaborate on why the global release topic keeps coming up. Purely due to release times, a lot of the community end up assuming that NA, or complexity limit specifically in this scenario, have a 16-hour advantage, as that is the exact amount of time between when limit has their reset and the raid goes live, and when EU has their reset and the raid goes live. This has resulted in quite a lot of back and forth about what actually constitutes a real world first. Luckily, we haven't had the situation occur yet, although it was very close in this tier, but there is a lot of talk about if an EU guild were to kill the final boss of the raid within 16 hours of an NA guild killing theirs, then it would be EU's real world first, because they would have killed the final boss in the least time. What's funny about this is that the vast majority of the individual players in the top guilds, they don't think that that advantage actually has a huge amount of impact when it comes to the actual race to world first. But this is why the global release is such an interesting topic. If the raid is released at the same time all over the world, that 16-hour advantage is then gone. There are other issues that come with a global release, but I'll get into those in just a moment.
Making characters on a new realm, I can almost guarantee, I don't know this, but I can almost guarantee you they'd have a few players that don't want to leave their EU accounts at all, and they would not want to do that, right? And also, why should they have to do that, right? And then asking us to either play on EU realms or even just wait 16 hours to start is insane. Or waiting until, I guess it would have been 10 hours this time, like after the maintenance. But yeah, I mean, it's just this weird thing that's been going on for 2 years. Obviously, everyone wants it. We want to start at the same time as them. I certainly don't want to hear from mad EU fans after races that what we've done wasn't legitimate. When I feel like it was, and you know that's terrible. It sucks the most for them. I won't even try to play yeah, we have downsides, but it's way worse for them. You know how bad? You guys ever watch someone be so excited to play a game that's coming out, and then and then a streamer gets it like 5 days early because he has a deal with the thing, and you're like, man, I'm kind of bummed to play that game now. I wanted to play it, but like this guy's just playing the game I want to play. They have to go through that every raid. There's a financial argument because we get a little less than 16 hours on day one of free content before anyone else gets it. In the race to world first, Echo and Limit control like 90% of the total viewership, or it's a bit more than that. And we just get a free day of content. If you're ever doing a boss that someone else has killed in the race to world first, unless you're specifically Echo starting a day later, it's old. So like they get a disadvantage that way. And then there's the constant feeling of stress of feeling like you're behind the entire raid. And you can't really quantify that into like an actual number, but it sucks. And also, you know what else sucks? The fact that Scripe and Roger put a ton of time into figuring out what to do on these bosses. I think Nyalotha was when they mentioned this, where that was the least fun raid they ever did, because they just started it and they were actually forced to do what we did on most every boss, and they like lose that creative aspect. If that was us, if I was a world 10th guild, if that's what like my role was, and all I did was I didn't have the creative problem solving element that makes the world first what I want to do, I wouldn't want to play the game anymore.
This is another quite interesting topic that Max has brought up in terms of the creative problem solving at the world first level. Raiding at a world first level is very unlike raiding at any other level, even as far below it as 4th, 5th, or 6th. Unless you are at the absolute cutting edge, the very top of the table, you won't know what it's like to have to formulate and execute your own strategies from start to finish. It's common practice now for EU guilds to look at what NA guilds have done on the earlier bosses of a raid on a new tier and just mimic whatever strategy has been proven to work, as the player skill across these guilds is usually high enough to execute it pretty well as long as it has been proven to work. So for example, things like Shriekwing, Huntsman Altamore, Hungering Destroyer, and maybe even Sun King's Salvation, certainly not even worth looking at as an EU guild when it comes to the pre-raid preparation. Anything beyond that, you could maybe think that there's a little bit of a call for maybe thinking of some kind of strategy, but at the same time you can still just look at the video, look at the evidence, and look at everything that's there about a kill that's already been done, and unless the boss looks particularly difficult, you don't really need to implement any kind of strategy of your own. It does mean that the EU guilds have a little bit of an advantage in that they can use a lot of their preparation time, especially during the beta or PTR testing. They could put a lot of that effort into the final bosses of the raid where possible.
a lot of people think this is like a really hard thing to do, the global release. Like, we don't have the technology. It's only 2021. Like, it's really simple to do these things. I do think it needs to be not just a global release. I don't think that's the fix to all the problems. I think it is kind of playing hand in hand with even things like heroic splits, because let's say you design a realm where you have the global release, because you don't want it everywhere, right? The casuals would suffer greatly and would be very bad for them. Or other people who are not casuals, they want to really not have the reset at 6 p.m. or something. You would still have problems where you then.
That's another very interesting point that's been brought up by Scripe this time. The fact that if you were to initiate a global release, it would likely have to come hand in hand with a change to the reset time and potentially the reset day of a certain region, in fact of every region, to all coincide and actually link up and be on exactly the same day and time. That's just not plausible. That's too big of a change across too wide of the player base that simply just doesn't care about this for it to be worth doing. Something that I feel like I need to say here is that I very much feel like we will never see a global release, ever. For the simple fact that it is only affecting a very small amount of the player base, and it kind of would potentially negatively impact the community at large if a global release were to actually be done. So let's say for argument's sake that we are going to have a global release. NA is going to release at 9 AM on the Tuesday as they do normally, and EU is going to have raid release at the same time, with their weekly reset still being on the Wednesday at 9 AM as it would have been normally. Again, for argument's sake, we will say that the lockout for the raid, for whatever new raid it may be, skips that first lockout, so the EU doesn't just end up having a certain number of hours, let's say, give or take about 16 hours, between the raid releasing and then the first reset happening. Otherwise, that would be 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 bosses, depending on the size of the raid, of free gear before going into a reset and re-killing those bosses. So again, for argument's sake, we'll say that the raid skips that first lockout, and that the first actual reset of the raid will be on the following Wednesday. This now gives EU an entire extra day within the first week. This doesn't change anything. If you go the opposite way, and you look to change the reset time for EU in order to fit that of NA, or vice versa, it's going to put the casual player base at a disadvantage, and it's going to mess things up for them in a way that just doesn't make any sense. Having a reset around prime time, around 5-6 PM in EU, is going to make a lot of people very unhappy. Logistically, again, very difficult to do. There is probably a way around this, but I certainly can't see a global release happening anytime soon. The point about conducting the Race to World First on a tournament realm is quite an interesting one, and one that I think could potentially work, but certain issues need to be resolved before that could actually be of any use. As Scripe mentioned, the fact that you wouldn't be able to bring people in to trade BOEs, the fact that your heroic splits would probably be impacted a bit, certainly in the way that they were done in Castle Nathria with the external help from the community, trading gold for being able to trade a piece of gear, it would certainly impact it quite negatively in that way. But at the same time, it could also be a fairly positive thing, as it could potentially push the game in a very positive direction in terms of the actual trading of gear, or even the acquisition of gear from the raid itself. The biggest issue that comes with trying to conduct the Race to World First on a tournament realm is how would you dictate what guilds could actually be competing? Would you just take a certain number of guilds from each region and offer them a spot on the tournament server? Or would you look to cap it at a number of guilds worldwide? On top of that, how would you determine how many characters each player can bring onto the tournament realm that they could use? There are certainly a lot more issues that would arise from a decision such as this, but as long as the initial problems was resolved, I think this could be quite a good way to actually push this forward.
Oh, and the one last thing I wanted to mention, I don't know if it was something you want to bring up afterwards, but I feel like we are reaching almost the upper echelon, if I'm not misusing that. Like we're reaching the real high top end of like what's possible to do to compete. We were way off 4 years ago. Like right now, you have people outside the raid, not just the raid leader that everyone sees. There's like a lot of other stuff that needs to be handled. Like just as an example, a BOE guy, right? Like someone that just literally goes and buys BOEs for you, and that's the only thing they do. Pretty much, that's what you needed to compete. Or a splits guy, someone that like prepares your splits. These kind of things, you kind of need them if you're serious about competing. And we're soon, I think, reaching the point. I mean, obviously, there's never like a hard cap, but we're getting close to the effective soft cap, let's say, of like what is humanly possible and
No,
makes sense.
He's exactly right, and also that's the avenue for a guild to catch up, is that how much better we can get is extremely limited, and how much better guilds under you can get, their ceiling is much higher. So that's the thing, if anything, that will close. Because obviously we're not getting any worse. We're going to do everything we can to get better, but how much better we can get is way less realistically than how much better the people under us can get.
So this is another very interesting point brought up collectively by both Roger and Max here, and they have effectively, it's piggybacking off of my last comment. We have the perfect way in front of us to be able to catch up to these top guilds. They are definitely performing at the absolute top level, and the rate at which they can actually get better and improve is certainly very minimal at this point. Whereas the growth potential for the guilds underneath, and the growth potential for example, a guild like us as Method, is actually a lot higher. The point about having so many outside sources of help be required, such as a BOE guy or a splits guy, is actually surprisingly accurate and apt for us as Method as a guild. We didn't really have someone who was specifically dedicated to BOEs. Actually, that's wrong. We did. We had someone who was dedicated to the purchase of BOEs, but they didn't do it all of the time. Sometimes someone would mention that they need a certain BOE, and it would be Biff who would go and get the BOE. It wouldn't be the same person who we had assigned for it. We didn't have a splits guy. That was mostly Biff sorting out the splits. It felt like Biff took a lot of the work on himself, and obviously it's one of those learning lessons going forward, but that point is exactly right. The amount of external help that you can have to make things go as smoothly as possible, then the better. You know, we ended up wasting quite a lot of time in terms of getting the splits together, getting consumables together, getting all of the BOEs organized. There was a lot of attention that was taken away from things that could have been more important. And you know, it's one of those things that you take from, you learn from it, and you move forward and you do better next time. But again, going back to the skill gap between Limit and Echo and the rest of the world might be quite big right now, but as Max said, the rate at which they can improve is certainly minimal. The rate at which the rest of us can improve is definitely a lot more. It's just that they have the experience that a lot of the guilds beneath them now don't have, and that is a huge part for any guild that's going to want to compete at a race to world first level. You cannot learn how to compete at a world first level without competing at a world first level, and it's a very difficult thing to break into. But you know, with all the best will in the world, I hope that there is another guild, if not us. I certainly hope it's us, and I think it could be us. I do hope that there is another guild that can look to compete by the end of this expansion. When it's the same two guilds, tier in, tier out, it does start to get a little bit tedious, and I think purely for the sake of the Race to World First event as it continues to grow, if people are seeing the same two guild names the whole time without any other kind of challenge to their title, then it does begin to get a little bit stale. The race between those two can be as exciting as you want it to be, but if it's the same two every time, sometimes it's nice to see some fresh faces, and sometimes it's nice to have an underdog to cheer for example. And maybe we can see that by the end of this expansion. It would certainly be nice. Something that became a little bit more prevalent as we came into Shadowlands was actually the number of guilds that were being picked up by organizations. Obviously following off of Method becoming an organization of their own and building into what they've become, and Limit being picked up by Complexity, other organizations ended up being more interested to get involved, especially as they saw the Race to World First growing. As that continues to grow, I would not be surprised to see more organizations getting involved, which can only be good for the Race to World First scene. If there's more resources in the Race to World First, guilds can then put in a lot more effort into actually competing for World First and going through each tier and learning from it and just getting better and better at a monumental rate in order to get to a point where they can actually compete. You have Eminem who took PMA, you had Reason who came and took Alterac Deviance until we merged with Method. You have Imperative who ended up partnering with Lazarus. There are a number of guilds that have been partnered with organizations, and I think that is a trend that we may see continue going forward. There needs to be proof. I think for it to continue at a rapid rate, I think there needs to be proof that some results can come of this kind of partnership, and that there is actually something there that's worth getting involved for. But if we can see that by the end of this tier, I think we could see definitely a lot more guilds getting involved with having organizations partnering up with them.
Alliance is insane. Alliance has objectively better racials than Horde for progression. The only caveat there is Goblin Jump, but that can be, there's so many Covenant abilities now that make that less of a thing.
This immediate point by Max about the faction imbalance is actually so true. The Alliance racials have slowly but surely just gotten better and better to the point that they are now definitively better than Horde racials. It's no longer like the days of old where Berserking and Blood Fury were absolutely monstrously overpowered in comparison to anything that Alliance had. And in particular, Mechanome and Lightforged Draenei have some pretty scary racials when it comes to PvE content.
Right. So no, Alliance is better. You would see a lot of people be Alliance if maybe it didn't cost the equivalent of like tens of thousands of dollars to transfer your guild Alliance for some reason. And then also if there was like I said, like even this raid, like we lose a lot by going Alliance just because of splits. Like if we're doing splits in Mythic Week and you go Alliance, you lose so much of your viewer base. And NA is outside of the Oceanic community. Alliance is basically dead. There's like a lot of NPCs, right? So you don't want to do that. I tweeted this the other day, but I think it kind of should be how the game is. You can mercenary mode in PvP at the end of every single expansion. Both factions come together in lore and fight one same common goal. I see zero reason why there can't be a story-based faction rivalry and world PvP and everything that goes along with it, but you can queue with people from different factions for PvE. There's all roads lead to that being just fine. I see very little issue with it. And if that was the case, I think we'd be Alliance pretty fast. And as far as fixing the faction imbalance, I don't know if that can be done. Let's just say Limit and Echo go Alliance right now. How long does it take for rating and Mythic Plus to be balanced on each faction? You know, you could randomly make something up. Maybe it's 2 raids, maybe it's 4 years, who knows? But even then, is that good? Why right now, if you want to Mythic Plus or raid, you just play on Horde. Everyone's there. Why would you want to split that in half? Again, part of the issue of not having things be able to queue with both factions is you would just be splitting the entire community across 2 factions, whereas right now they're all on one. So it's just overall bad and weird.
Issue of faction imbalance is something that I don't think will ever truly be solved. If you end up making one faction on purpose significantly stronger than the other, and people, for example, if the player base was to begin to slowly but surely trickle back towards Alliance, and more people would keep going, and more people would keep going, it's not going to balance anything. There will still be that imbalance. All it's going to do is just swing the pendulum back the other way. As Max has said, and I completely agree with him on this point, I think the only thing that's actually going to solve that kind of faction imbalance is to just embrace the imbalance and remove some of the limitations about playing on opposite factions. By all means, leave in the storyline rivalry between the 2 factions if they want to keep going with that. Who knows where the story will go at any given point in time, and keep world PvP and keep battlegrounds and all that. The actual mechanics of the game don't need to change, but being able to actually group with people from opposite factions, it would add a bigger sense of community to the game, rather than people feeling like they had to play a certain faction because they want to play a certain type of content. Alright, so that was my look at the roundtable as hosted by Preach with Echo and Complexity Limit. I hope you guys enjoyed this video today, and again, do let us know what you thought down in the comments below. My name's Danwarr, and I'll see you guys next time.